Well, hello and welcome to another video by Financial Learning. On today's video, we're going to take a look at the Bitcoin mining stocks short score rankings. We're going to be ranking them based off of the short percent with respect to free float for each of these 15 publicly traded mining stocks. We're also going to look at the price of Bitcoin and compare it with this entire sector on a weekly and monthly basis. We're also going to take a look at the top 5 most shorted Bitcoin mining stocks for the week ending May 23rd. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, so jumping right in, we're going to start with the far left column. That's going to be the Bitcoin mining tickers. So again, these are all publicly traded companies. And I want to pay attention to these three that I have highlighted in yellow. And I do have Core Scientific actually with the font in red. They went from number 6 down to number 8 just this past week. And what I think actually caused this drop is going to be the overall number of shares that was increased in their free float. So there was, at least according to the Ortex data, some dilution for Core Scientific. That did actually cause a reduction on the overall number of shares shorted because it is the number of shares shorted divided by the overall free float. So obviously, if the free float is to increase, then that short percent would decrease. So past that, let's take a look at the other information here. We can see that on May 16th, you can see the various prices for the Friday closing period, and then comparing that with May 23rd. First off, I want to show that all of the stocks on Friday did close red, and that's because the price of Bitcoin did drop this past week. So when comparing it to its all-time high, there was a lot of bullishness in the overall sector. Some of these miners, they actually did have a rather lackluster price action when comparing that with the price of Bitcoin. And then when the price of Bitcoin did drop, the overall mining sector dropped with it. So taking a look at that, first off, let's compare the weekly. We can see here that comparing the 23rd to the 16th, you can see that a few of these stocks actually did end up having some positive gains. And I did bold the highest drop as well as the highest gain for the week. And the highest drop is actually going to be Canaan with a negative 20% in terms of that share price drop. And then Camgo actually had a positive 11%, and that is for that Friday to Friday trading period. So those are the highest changing prices for these 15 different companies that I have been covering. And then another thing I think is worth looking at is that max pain value. So this coming up Friday, the max pain is actually red for most of these companies. And the reason why I have it red is if you look at the closing price of the stock on last Friday, on May 23rd, for the most part, it is still higher than that max pain. So the market makers would like to pull that price down to get it closer to that max pain pricing because that gives them the highest opportunity for revenue where they're not having to pay out as much for options traders that may be in the money at the current time. But moving over into the share short, again, if any of these cells are highlighted red, it's because the short percent did decrease for the last trading day. And I am looking at that Friday estimated trading period when I do choose this color. And then the various cells that are highlighted green mean that the short percent increased compared to the previous trading day. And then you can also see BTDR. They remain flat. There was no change in short percent when comparing the Thursday trading period with the Friday estimated trading period. Moving over another column, you can take a look at the free float value. All of these cells that are highlighted yellow means that the free float did change when compared to just 1 week ago. And I do have that delta on free float, 2 columns over there. And the one, as I mentioned, that is definitely the highest change is going to be Core Scientific with 18 million shares getting added to the free float. And again, I'm using Ortex estimate data. So there are times when this share count will fluctuate back and forth. But overall, just want to kind of point that out for you, those of you who are using some of this data to just analyze the various Bitcoin mining stocks. And then looking at the weekly short percent change. So instead of just looking at the daily, let's compare Friday to Friday. And you can see here that for the majority, the short interest actually decreased. There was just a few where the short interest actually increased, and one of them was CIFR. the short interest for CIFR did actually go up by 2%. And then as far as the highest drop for the past week, that is going to be with Mara, with a negative 1.52% drop in short interest when comparing Friday to Friday trading periods. So that's the overall sector in terms of the various pricing and in terms of the short interest and the overall free float value. But let's take a look at some of the other information in terms of pricing and shares shorted when we're looking at it again by the weekly and monthly. And then we're going to compare Bitcoin. So first off, just comparing the Bitcoin mining sector, when looking back 1 week ago, you can actually see that the overall shares shorted actually increased by 2,702,000 shares. And the value actually dropped by about $250,151,000. And as I did mention, the entire sector did end up closing red for the day on Friday. So after that nice run up on Bitcoin, when there was a pullback, it went from about almost 112,000 down to around 110. Now we're sitting around 108, 107,000. So because of that pullback, and you can see that Bitcoin did close at 107,287 this past Friday, it did end up pulling the entire sector down. So again, that value actually decreased. However, the number of shares shorted did increase. So again, that's just showing the overall market sentiment. They are adding to the overall shares being shorted. And moving over again, you can actually see that the change in weekly short percent was actually negative 0.03%. So almost closing flat, just a negative 0.03 in terms of that short interest change. And then looking at the free float value, actually we had a reduction in value on the Bitcoin mining sector this past week, as much as 742,722,000. And that ended up coming out at a negative 3.27% in terms of the value of free float. That was the change when comparing it to just 1 week ago. But when we compare it to 1 month ago, when we look back at April 25th closing information, you can see that the number of shares being shorted has still increased when compared to a month ago by 3,391,000, and the overall value of these shares being shorted has increased. So the overall mining sector has increased in value. It's actually increased by 525,796,000 in terms of these shares being shorted. The overall free float value, that's changed by even more. So let's take a look at that. You can actually see here that the overall free float value, when comparing to 1 month ago, it's actually increased by $3,323,051,000. So again, that's about a 17.85% to be precise in terms of free float value change when comparing to just 1 month ago. So the entire sector did basically bounce off of a lot of their 52-week lows back near the middle of April. So we still see it holding a pretty strong value. Although we did have a slight pullback this past week, I am not concerned. As long as the price of Bitcoin can continue to hover and start to climb back up, I do feel that the entire Bitcoin mining sector is going to benefit from that. Because again, they're mining daily. So they are getting a nice revenue each day as the price of Bitcoin does stay above $100,000. Now, when we move down to compare Bitcoin to the overall mining sector, again, as I mentioned, price of Bitcoin closed on Friday at $107,287 per Bitcoin. And comparing that to 1 week ago, the price of Bitcoin was $103,489. So that is a change of $3,700 or 3.5%. So where we did see the overall Bitcoin mining sector drop by 3.27%, the price of Bitcoin actually increased by 3.5%. So again, it's about a 3.5, almost 7% swing in terms of value when looking at the Bitcoin mining sector compared to the actual price of Bitcoin. But if we were to look at a monthly comparison of price of Bitcoin, you can see Bitcoin price was at $94,720. So that's an 11.7 increase. But when we compare that against the Bitcoin mining sector, the mining sector still beat the price of Bitcoin in terms of price appreciation because their increase was 17.85%. So again, before we move on to the top 5 most shorted Bitcoin mining stocks, I did just want to pause and discuss my thoughts on the overall Bitcoin mining sector. As we are about halfway through the quarter, Uh, the quarter will close in June. As long as the price of Bitcoin can close higher than the start of the quarter, I do believe we'll see a lot of positive valuation in the Bitcoin mining sector. Quite a few of these companies, they do hold a Bitcoin treasury, so that treasury will gain in value, and that will help a lot of them in terms of their overall earnings report, because they do have to actually track that fair value of Bitcoin price change. Outside of that, just for the fact that the price of Bitcoin has been staying in six figures over really the past about 2.5 weeks, again, that's helping the overall Bitcoin mining sector. We're seeing really healthy margins for a lot of these companies, especially the ones that decide to just sell all their Bitcoin. They are definitely able to capitalize on this price change. But again, if the price of Bitcoin continues to change, and we do see that in some of the Bitcoin power law modeling as well as some other charts, then the companies that are holding Bitcoin, they're just going to continue to see even higher valuation for their company because, again, their assets as holding this digital currency will continue to increase. It's just going to improve their overall price to book value. So I'm very interested to see how the price of Bitcoin continues to interact with a lot of these companies. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why aren't these Bitcoin miners jumping up in valuation when Bitcoin hits its all-time high? And I do believe that we are seeing a lot of pair trading still going on with a lot of these Bitcoin miners. So whether it's individual investors, whether it's institutional investors or hedge funds, I do believe we are seeing some of them that maybe are long Bitcoin either through the actual holding of Bitcoin itself or through various ETFs. They may be hedging their investment using the Bitcoin mining sector, and they're doing that by shorting the Bitcoin mining stocks. So how that helps them is if the price of Bitcoin was to pull back and the entire Bitcoin mining sector drastically drops even more than the price of Bitcoin, that volatility is what a lot of these investors and hedge funds are using in order to reduce that downward price action of Bitcoin. So they're able to overly compensate for that price of Bitcoin changing. However, as more and more institutions, as more and more people see the value that the Bitcoin mining sector is bringing in and decide to continue holding long, I do believe we will see a reduced amount of shares available for additional shorting. So when that does happen, I think we will see some hard to borrow situations with some of these Bitcoin mining stocks, which is going to lead us to having some higher cost of borrow percentages. So with that, it's actually going to reduce some of the opportunities that these hedge funds or institutions or investors make by these pair trades. So I'm wondering if we start to see some of the pair trades maybe being reduced. And if that happens, I do believe we will see the short percent actually starting to get reduced on some of these Bitcoin mining stocks. So I am still very bullish on the Bitcoin mining sector. I do believe that fundamentally they're in a very good position. However, the price action just isn't necessarily reflecting that at this moment. Just my opinion. Love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you drop it in the comments and let me know. But with all that being said, let's take a look at the top 5 most shorted Bitcoin mining stocks again for the week of May 23rd. Coming in at number 5 on our list is Riot. That is ticker symbol RIOT. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 24.18%. Comparing that to 1 week ago, it was 24.34%. So a slight decrease in short interest with respect to free float for Riot when comparing Thursday to 1 week ago. And looking at the overall days to cover, currently at 2.87 days, and then utilization sitting at 44.75. And again, just to remind you, if you're new to the channel, utilization is going to be the number of shares being shorted divided by the overall number of shares available on loan. And that would include the shares that are being loaned out as well as the shares that are available for being loaned out. And then taking a look at that short score, it's at 68.44. Now, at the bottom left, you can take a look at the price action for Riot, and this would be over the past month or so. I will be having this price table at the bottom. I will be having this price graph at the bottom left on the next couple of stocks as well. But moving over on the bottom right, we're going to take a look at that live short interest data for Riot, and this is going to be that Friday Ortex estimated data. This is that short interest with respect to free float it was at 24.19%. And that is an increase when compared to that Thursday trading period. And taking a look at the Interactive Brokers short availability, last reported shares available was just 950,000 with a cost to borrow at 1.04%. So as we do see the number of shares available starting to get reduced on some of these companies, that cost to borrow will increase, and that is really going to make it less favorable for these various companies, institutions, or investors to continue shorting these specific Bitcoin mining companies. So again, pay attention to those numbers. And again, this is not the only brokerage that actually lends out the shares, but it should give a good representation of the overall number of shares that are available compared to the cost to borrow. So again, maybe at some of the other brokers or exchanges, you may be able to find some additional shares, but at some point you will start to see hard to borrow listed on these various stocks, and you will see that cost to borrow percent increasing as well. Coming in at number 4 on our list is Mara Holdings. That is ticker symbol MARA. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 24.94%. We're comparing that to 1 week ago, it was 25.11. So a slight decrease in short interest with respect to free float for Mara. Next is going to be days to cover, coming in at just 2 days. And then utilization is at 69.68%. Short score for Mara is at 72.02. Live short interest with respect to free float, this is that Ortex estimated Friday data. They were at 25.26%. So an increase on short interest with respect to free float compared to just 1 day ago. And taking a look at the Interactive Broker short availability, last reported shares available was just 450,000 with a cost to borrow at 0.58%. So this cost to borrow number actually surprises me a little bit. I would have assumed with such a small amount of shares being available for Mara that that cost to borrow would have started to creep up a little bit. I guess we'll have to keep our eyes on it when trading resumes on Tuesday just to see how this may impact the shares available and cost to borrow. Coming in at number 3 on our list is BitDeer. That is ticker symbol BTDR. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 28.04%, and they remain flat when comparing it to just 1 week ago. And then taking a look again, comparing that Friday to Thursday, we'll get to it in a minute, but also it was flat. So BitDeer, short interest, really has remained pretty much static. And there is a reason for that, so let's continue on. Moving over into days of cover, currently at 4.3 days, and then utilization. Here's why, folks. Utilization is at 100%. So that means out of the number of shares being shorted, it's actually the entire amount of shares available for loan. So that short interest cannot continue to increase if there's no shares available. We will take a look at that shares available to just see what those estimated amounts are. But according to this information, really BitDeer is pretty much locked up in terms of the number of shares available for shorting. So unless the company begins to dilute, so unless these companies decide to buy shares and reduce their overall short position, I really don't see much of a change in the near future here for BitDeer. But moving over to short score, it's at 78.51. Now moving down into that live short interest with respect to free float data, this is that Friday Ortex estimate information. They did have that number coming in again at 28.04. So no change really since a week ago for BitDeer in terms of that short interest. So when we do look at that Interactive Broker short availability, they do have last shares available reporting in at 600,000 shares, and that cost to borrow is 1.3%. So I do find that kind of interesting that it does state that there are shares available. However, it's also stating that these shares are being fully utilized. And again, we're not seeing any changes in terms of that short interest for BitDeer. So I think it's rather interesting that the company is fully utilized on those shorted shares. So I'm really interested to see if shorting becomes a factor this next trading week for BitDeer. And coming in at number 2 on our list is going to be CleanSpark Inc. That is ticker symbol CLSK. They had a short interest with respect to free float of 30.74%. Again, this is for that Thursday trading period. And then taking a look 1 week ago, it was 31.41. So a pretty good amount of decrease in short interest with respect to free float for CleanSpark. But looking at days to cover, currently at 3.18 days. So we have seen a slight reduction on days to cover for CleanSpark, and that's because the overall trading volume has been increasing when you look at the volume versus the average over the last couple of trading days. So again, when that happens, you do see the days to cover actually being reduced. And it's set up in a way to where the shorts are able to cover based off of that overall volume. So they try to make it fair in terms of the overall market mechanics for them to be able to get out of their leveraged positions. And then taking a look at the utilization for CleanSpark, it's at 78.6%. Short score is at 75.26. Now, looking at that live short interest data, this is for that Ortex estimated Friday trading period. The short interest did grow again, and it's at 31.08%. So again, about a 1.11% increase when compared to just one day ago. Now, CleanSpark's price action, it did see a rather nice increase on the Thursday, but then Friday, because of the pullback on Bitcoin, we did see it drop back down. So I'm going to be watching CleanSpark very heavily this next week. I am an investor in the company, so I'm interested to see how the price action does react and if we do get any news. Take a look at the Interactive Broker short availability. Last reported shares available for CleanSpark was still 2.5 million with a cost of borrow of 0.5%. Now let's move on to the number one most shorted Bitcoin mining stock for the week of May 23rd. And coming in at number one on our list of short interest stocks for the Bitcoin mining sector is TeraWulf. That is ticker symbol WULF. They had a short interest with respect to free float at 32.2%. Comparing that with 1 week ago, it was 31.95%. So a slight increase on short interest with respect to free float for TeraWulf. Moving over into days to cover, currently at 2.33 days, and utilization for TeraWulf at 77.62%. Short score is at just 69.24. Moving down into the live short interest data, this is that Ortex Friday estimated data. Short interest was 32.11%, so a slight decrease when compared to just one trading day ago. And taking a look at the Interactive Broker short availability, last reported shares available at 5.9 million with the cost of borrow at 0.45%. Now, before I close this out, I did want to take a moment to mention that the Bitcoin conference is happening this next week, and I am actually going to be there walking the floors, trying to meet some of these Bitcoin mining companies, as well as maybe some of these Bitcoin investment companies. So if you have any specific questions you'd like me to ask, drop those in the comments and I'll do my best to reach out to these companies if they're at the conference and see if I can get those questions answered. All right, and that about wraps up for me. Hope you enjoyed this quick update on the short interest rankings for the Bitcoin mining sector, again for the week of May 23rd. We did see the price of Bitcoin climb up on Friday about 3% or so, and we saw the Bitcoin mining sector drop by about 3.5%. But again, comparing to about a month ago, the Bitcoin mining sector still did a rather excellent job of bouncing off of those 52-week lows. So depending on when you invested, you may still be in the green on the Bitcoin mining sector. But if you have been investing a little bit longer, you may still be frustrated at the price action. And it is understandable as the majority of what's driving these companies is Bitcoin itself. So you would think that as the price of Bitcoin increased, the overall valuation of these companies in terms of their price would also increase. But that's just not the way the market is working currently. And again, I kind of gave you my 2 cents on that. So if you did like the video, consider giving it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts about the Bitcoin mining stocks and the overall sector, and how do you think they will react this next week as we have this Bitcoin conference going on? Do you think we'll have a lot of bullish sentiment and potentially more Bitcoin buyers? I guess we'll have to wait and see. And with all that said, hope you all have a great rest of your day. Keep calm, hash on, and I'll see you on the next one.